another story that I think caught some people here in the US off guard, and that was Donald Trump threatening military action in the West African nation of Nigeria, allegedly to protect Christians. I think there's probably more to it than that, and maybe that isn't a part of it at all. But nonetheless, we are very, very happy to be joined to help us sort through it all by David Hundeyin, who's a Nigerian investigative journalist and author. David, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I guess the first question, and what a lot of people have been wondering, and I'm sure you've seen is sort of the main topic of discussion around this for the in the U.S. media is, whether or not there is in fact a genocide of Christians, and then also what is sort of the security situation in Nigeria. So, just to maybe set the stage for people, if you could give some context about what's actually going on here, which I think for most people on this side of the Atlantic, they don't know a lot about.
So I guess the easiest way to understand what is happening in Nigeria is to understand the context that on the surface, it's a poor country. In reality, in terms of resource endowment, it has absurd resource endowment to the extent that even many of us who live in Nigeria aren't even aware of. And it just so happened that sometime in 2013, 2014, when Boko Haram became a nationwide problem, when it became an issue of not a non-state actor actually holding land and actually facing off against the military. Um, it's the idea then was that these are Islamic terrorists. This is a religious thing. They're burning churches and things like that. And then over the intervening decade or so, it's been the case that they've slaughtered anything from 50 to 150,000 people. We don't have actual numbers because the records are very sketchy in these parts. And the significant majority of these people who have been murdered have actually been Muslim because the part of the country where the violence is taking place, for the most part, the north and middle belt, tends to be Muslim dominated, more so in the north. So it's been, I guess, a very difficult story to contextualize because what do you call it when a group of terrorists calling themselves Islamists who claim they want to set up a caliphate are murdering Muslims in more numbers than anybody else, right? Very conservative Muslims as well. What is
Hmm.
going on here? So what has tended to happen is that the deaths of Muslims has entered a weird memory hole because it's almost not covered at all. And then because these people also attack Christians, the deaths of those Christians are what is then covered.
Hmm.
And that is what is then sort of codified into these narratives that are then sold to politicians like Donald Trump. And I would know this because I was part of a research project in 2019 where we actually went around the northern parts of the country documenting some of these massacres that were taking place. At the time, I didn't understand the geopolitical significance of what I was doing. I just thought I was a journalist trying to do the right thing. But what actually happened was when that report was put together, it was two British funded NGOs who were behind the project. The report was called Silent Slaughter, Genocide in Nigeria and Implications for the International Community. That report was submitted to the then US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the then Vice President, Mike Pence. And the claim made in that report was that there's a genocide against Nigerian Christians taking place. Now, what that report claimed as the basis for that idea that there's a genocide taking place was not that Christians were specifically being targeted and nobody else. What it said was based on the population share of Christians in those areas, the number of Christians who died in these attacks versus the number of Muslims who died is disproportionate. In other words, if there's, say, a 90% to 10% population split between Muslims and Christians, and there's an attack where 100 people died, this is a very crude uh, example that I'm giving. According to the statistical population split, 10 Christians should die and 90 Muslims should die. But if 20 Christians die and 80 Muslims die, you can then say that more Christians have died than their population share. And that was the basis of the claim that there's a
Hmm.
genocide, which, as you can imagine, is a very problematic claim to make because there's still 80 dead Muslims. What do you call them? You know, again, I have to stress I didn't understand the full import of what I was doing then, but it all starts to make sense now, especially when you realize that this NGO that I was working with then actually had the stated goal of that project was to get the US Secretary of State to appoint a special envoy to Nigeria. If you recall what
Mm,
happened in Sudan, when the US appointed a special envoy to Sudan, that was when Sudan got split off into North Sudan and South Sudan. So apparently that was the goal behind this project, which has been running for a number of years. And Donald Trump or the people around Donald Trump have simply accelerated this, I would imagine, because the geopolitical situation, especially regarding the trade war with China, has made them have to accelerate certain things. So, which goes back to what I was saying about Nigeria's resource endowment. Now, if you're trying to analyze the violence from a religious standpoint, it makes no sense because why the hell are they killing so many Muslims? The only thing you can use to contextualize this violence is by looking at a map, a geological map of Nigeria's solid minerals endowment, and mapping it with where these killings are taking place, and you realize what you're looking at. You're basically looking at people being um, cleared off their land, and the land essentially being turned into a huge open pit mine. That's a very crude way of putting it, but that's pretty much what is happening.
mm,
And to sort of cover over the fact that you have, huge global commercial interests that are basically wiping out poor people for the sake of what is under their feet, you then have this chimera being sold that somehow it's about religion. Meanwhile, both Christians and Muslims and African traditional religious practitioners, everyone is dying in numbers, and they're all poor people and they're all powerless. So
mm.
that's what is actually happening in Nigeria. So the recent threats by Donald Trump talking about, oh, he's going to come in guns a blazing and whatnot. That's what you would call in political terms, you'd call it kabuki theater, because that's what it is. Um, Clearly, the U.S. government has a predetermined interest in Nigeria. It has based on the stated what's it called the so-called Kissinger report, which was released, I believe, in 1974. It was stated very clearly in that report, which anyone can download off Google, that the long-term economic development of Nigeria to a place where it starts to use its own resources, its population grows to a certain extent, is considered to be a threat
Mm,
to US national security interests. That has been the position of the US on Nigeria for well on 50 years now. So that is already established. And then you then have a situation where the Chinese government has enacted these export controls against the US with regards to rare earth refining. And you then had, I believe his name is Scott Bessent, your Secretary of Trade, I think he is, or Commerce.
hmm
I forget his
Treasury, yeah.
designation.
Treasury. Hmm.
Treasury, yes, yeah. He went on, I believe it was MSNBC, and said the US intends to build out an alternative supply chain for its rare earths in 2 years. Now, where, first of all, are you likely to get these so-called rare earth minerals in the volumes that you need, in the commercial volumes that you need, where there is no other geopolitical or commercial player that is currently active or that currently controls that space? There's only one place in the world, and that's in Sahelian West Africa. And the northern Nigeria falls well into that scope. And then the what then further complicates it is the process of refining rare earths, as I'm sure you're aware, it's an extremely environmentally toxic and dangerous process. So that is obviously not something that the US government probably intends to onshore. It probably wants to keep it offshored. But since China will no longer play that role, where is the next best option now? So you then have this place called Nigeria, which is a weak state. It's a US client state anyway. It's run by a US puppet government. It's there for the taking, has a relatively weak military for its size, and it has all this resource endowment, has all the exact rare earths that you need. And as far as you're concerned, its environment is there for the taking. It can be destroyed. All the environmental devastation can be effectively outsourced to Nigeria, and you reap all the benefits. So it would make sense from an American perspective, from an imperial American perspective, that this is what you would do. Why I would imagine it hasn't actually manifested is I would imagine probably has something to do with the fact that the Chinese government, very much unlike China, by the way, actually chose to get involved this time around. Typically, China has this habit of just sort of staying out of it or just watching things play out in this part of the world. But for whatever reason, this time around, the Chinese Foreign Ministry actually issued a fairly strongly worded statement, not dissimilar to the kind of statements that have been issued with regard to Venezuela. So I would imagine that the type of diplomatic engagement between the US and China has shifted significantly over the past decade. And China is more willing to flex muscles now in a way that it probably wasn't before. And that's probably the reason why we're having this conversation, because I believe if it weren't for that, we would have already had, one or two airstrikes at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing you bring up with regard to China. Not you haven't heard the US mentioning China in this, but what you will hear often is that China's the one exploiting Africa. China's the one being vile and like trying to be the new imperialist in Africa. And I'm just curious your thoughts on the Chinese relationship towards a country like Nigeria, towards the US relationship towards a country in Nigeria. I haven't heard the Chinese threatening military intervention, for example. Not saying they're angels. I actually don't quite know, but what's your take when you kind of like juxtapose these two powers?
Now, the Chinese definitely have never threatened military action in Nigeria, nor are they likely to. China's mode of engagement in Nigeria is verifiable. You can literally just Google it. What does China do in Nigeria? China basically builds stuff. The model of Chinese diplomacy is if we build stuff for you and we integrate you into our, mega economy, then we are essentially building influence with you. That's their own way of building influence. Some people would call it control, whatever. I don't have a problem with that because when you compare that to the US method of engagement, which is basically keep tight control over the political and information space, and basically the country can absolutely rot away. It doesn't matter. The US vision for Nigeria is pretty much exactly what Nigeria is, which is a country that is artificially impoverished. To put some perspective here, Nigeria is now the world's third largest World Bank debtor and the largest World Bank debtor in Africa. Right. It used to be a huge IMF debtor. Yeah, but there's been a bit of like shifting numbers around on the books. So a lot of that debt, officially Nigeria claims to be IMF to be debt free from the IMF. It shifted a whole lot of that debt to the World Bank, right? So it now owes an amount that is worth, multiple times the annual Nigerian budget to the World Bank. And that's how the US likes Nigeria. Don't build any infrastructure, don't invest in education, remove all subsidies because subsidies are not for you poor people. And basically, increase your tax net. These are all in the IMF recommendations, which you can read on the IMF website anyway. Which is why over the past couple of years, we've had essentially a structural adjustment policy through the back door. The value of the Naira has cratered. As at May 2023, it was $1 to about 700 Naira. Now it's about $1 to roughly 1,500 Naira. So the value of Nigeria's money has halved in 2 years. It's still very much an import dependent economy because again, part of that model for US engagement is anything that encourages sovereignty, such as, for example, the ability to grow your own food, your defense industry. You don't need those things, right? You can just import just enough to keep you going. And the stuff you need to import, which is, US dollars, will lend that to you. But obviously, in exchange for that loan, then you're going to need to devalue your currency. And that cycle of dependency just keeps rolling over and over and over and over, which is why a country with 230 million people and the absurd resource endowment that it has is this poor. It doesn't make any sense except you analyze it through that lens. Now, the Chinese model for engagement is radically different. First of all, the Chinese are not giving you loans; they're not giving you money because they know very well if they give you the government of an African country $5 billion in cash, all that money is going to do is that it's going to find its way to the US and to Dubai and to London. That's all that's going to happen. It's not going to accomplish anything on the ground. People are just going to steal it. So what they do is that they essentially give state credit to state-owned corporations in China, such as the China Railway Construction Company or the China Civil Engineering Construction Company, and they come to Nigeria and they basically build stuff on the ground. So for example, the Lagos to Ibadan railway line is the 180-kilometer line, which is, I believe, it's the most recent one of the new rail lines that are being constructed, that was China from end to end. The rail stations, the rail track, the everything, the entire project, the financing was through the China Exim Bank. And that project now exists. The trains themselves, also Chinese funded. The Abuja to Kaduna railway line, also Chinese. The Warri to Itakwe railway line, also Chinese. The new Warri deep sea port, also Chinese. The new Lagos deep sea port, also Chinese. The Lagos metro system, also Chinese. There's so
Wow.
many examples of this all over the country. The Abuja Metropolitan Railway System, also Chinese. So that's the Chinese way of engaging with you. That instead of trying to bully you, and instead of trying to create a debt trap, which is what the IMF and the World Bank really are, we will rather use infrastructure and trade terms to integrate you into our economy. So you might recall, for example, recently you saw the Chinese announce that Nigeria was part of a deal that they had with several African countries, that these countries would have 0% tariffs on their trade with China. Imagine what an impact it would have on Nigeria's economy if the US were to permit Nigeria to have 0% tariff access to the US economy. Well, obviously, it would never do that, right? So if the choice is presented between Chinese economic and political engagement, which, by the way, in addition to the economic pluses you get out of the engagement with China, you also get the political plus of basically non-interference, right? The
Mm.
Chinese don't interfere in your politics. They don't fund NGOs that support regime change operations. They don't fund political opposition. They don't fund adversarial media. All of these dirty tricks that the US government is constantly doing and constantly interfering and constantly having more of a say in your own country than you, the Chinese don't do that. So
Yeah.
if you're giving me the choice between US engagement and Chinese engagement, and then you're telling me, oh, the Chinese are, China is not a democracy and it's a communist country. Well, that makes no difference to me. That makes absolutely no difference to me because there's only one deal.
The
There's only
results
there's
speak
only
for
one game in
themselves.
town.
No,
Exactly.
absolutely, for sure. Absolutely. Well, as always, David, we really appreciate you joining us, sorting through it all. A lot to continue to cover. David Hundeyin, author and journalist from Nigeria. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.